What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to JEB and Flow here on the Street Parking Podcast channel. Coming at you from the quarry once again. Liking it in here. It's kind of a cool vibe, But I do miss the office and my awesome sign. So hopefully I will get back there soon. But everything is good. Everything is good as long as I've got a way to talk and you've got a way to read or hear me, then we're good. We can communicate. And that's actually a lot of what I wanted to talk about today. I was thinking just how crazy communication is. Specifically, language in the form of spoken word, sign language, body language, nonverbal communications, all of that. It's really, really fascinating that we have found ways to agree on what things mean so that we can understand other people's experience and we can get them to understand our experience. And then once we both understand, we realize there's common ground, and then we connect. And a whole lot of other things happen too. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating. So let's start from the beginning. At least in the beginning, the beginning of where I got off on this whole trip of language and how ultimately language should or could lead to acceptance. And acceptance is a pathway to happiness, to contentment, to fulfillment. So if we can understand the role of language in acceptance, it can be a useful tool. Think about this. You have a thought. And that thought obviously is influenced by your own experience, your upbringing, the things that have happened in your life, and how you feel about the things that have happened in your life. You have a thought. And you want to communicate that thought to someone else. So you take the thought and you package it up. You put it in this package with words. And you choose the words based on the words that you know, that are available to you, that are in your database, in your brain. And those words, even though you might know 10 words that roughly mean the same thing, the word that you choose, for some reason, maybe you have an association with that word that just makes it a little bit more accurate in describing the thought that you're trying to communicate. So you have this thought, you put it in this package, you package it up, you tie it up with a little bow on it, right? This word package. And then you ship it over to the receiver, the person that you're trying to communicate with. So now they receive this package. And it's beautifully wrapped up in all of these words. So they start pulling out the words one at a time. And the thing is that those words have just a slightly different context or meaning for that receiver, for that person. Because the word that they get from you, well, it might trigger some memory. And so they might have some association towards some other thing that happened in their life that's connected to that word. So by the time they pull all of these words apart and get to your thought, that thought has now been perhaps changed. They can only understand that thought in the context of what all of those words mean for them. So as best they can, they try to understand this thought that you have given them. As best they can, they try to understand this thought. And they take it in and they process this thought. And they have a response. That thought triggers a response. And the response is a result of what your thought has aroused within them. Once again, in the context of all of their own experiences, their own associations, their own memories, and depending on their level of compassion or empathy, how much of their willingness to try to understand your thought on your terms also gets wrapped up in the cultivation of that response that they are trying to craft. So it's their interpretation of the thought that you sent over, the interpretation that has been filtered through the words that have been used. They sort of cross-reference it against their whole value system and everything. They come up with a response. They take that response, they wrap it up in a bunch of words that have the right meaning, the most accurate meaning that they possibly can think of to best describe this response. And they tie it up with a nice little bow, some other little fancy words, and they ship it back over to you. And the process repeats. Now that's if people are speaking the same language. If you're not speaking the same language, then it's hard to understand what the heck the person's trying to say. And I think two people could be speaking English and still not be speaking the same language because the words that they're using are so ingrained in the alternative meaning that they might have for those individuals, or the unwillingness to try to understand what the words mean for the other person. So we'll get into that in a second. But language can be interpreted differently. And so, like, for example, I know very little Spanish, but I could survive in a Spanish-speaking country. I could get around. I would probably make some people impatient, but I could manage. If somebody says something to me in Spanish, I have to stop and I have to think about, okay, this word means this, and this word means that, and that word. So then I have to translate it into English, and then I have to put those words together so I then know what the English sentence is, and then I come up with my answer to that, translate it back to Spanish, and then say it back. So it's a very slow process. But if you think about it, it's not that much different when speaking the same language. There's a little bit more agreement on what the words mean objectively. But on a subjective level, there's still a lot of variance. And in fact, maybe a lot more confusion is possible because we think that this word means this. Yet the way that this person is reacting to what I said is an odd reaction because I didn't say this intending for this reaction. So there must be some disconnect. But we both know the words that we're using. We both agree on their meaning. But maybe we don't agree on the meaning. Maybe we're just assuming. Language is a funny thing. There is some cultures that I was reading about. And like, for example, you've heard that there's some Inuit or Eskimo cultures that have 50 or 100 different words for snow. Because if you live close to the Arctic, where there's so much snow all the time, then obviously there's going to be different types of snow. There's going to be a lot of different characteristics of the snow. And the snow is going to have different meaning at different times. So it would make sense that there's a whole bunch of different words for snow. I was reading about another, now I can't remember if it was, I've been reading about like some more indigenous kind of cultures and tribes that are still in existence, like in Aboriginal Australia and in the Amazon. And there was a couple that was really, really fascinating to me. There was one group of people who spoke a language that didn't have numbers. There was just no numbers. There was a word for basically none. There was a word for some. And there was a word for many. And then there was a word for like many, like a lot of a lot. Pretty much 4 descriptors for quantity. There's either none or there's some, which I thought was so awesome. I feel like that's really cool, but obviously, that really changes the meaning of things. If you're from a place that's very, very focused on, well, is it 1 or is it 3? I need to know, do I have a dozen of these or do I have 6? And there's someone over here that's, well, either there's some or there's not. The way that you understand amounts and quantities is going to be very different. And you can kind of go down that little rabbit hole on your own. I won't get super into it, but I went down it. And if you think about the implication of having numbers or not having numbers in your language, it would really greatly change your experience of the world. And if you have a different experience of the world, then there's a lot of opportunity to learn from other people, but there's also a lot of opportunity to be misunderstood. So I'm going to get into that in a second. There was another group that I read about that, let's see if I can explain this, but basically they wouldn't be able to answer anything in the affirmative if they weren't right there. So the example would be if you ask somebody, how many chickens do you have? And they were not standing by their chicken coop. They're out, let's say you're out in the forest and dude's chicken coop is back home. So you're 5 miles away from the chicken coop. And you're like, how many chickens do you have? They can't say I have 6 chickens. The language only allows them to say, the last time that I was at home, there were 6 chickens. Which again if you think about the implications of those linguistic rules, will take you down a really interesting rabbit hole of how different an experience might be if it just didn't exist in your language. Body language is another big one. There's a lot of cultures where smiling has a vastly different meaning. So there's some cultures where if someone's nervous, they will smile. And then obviously we kind of, at least in Western culture, the way that I'm brought up, like smiling is a warm, it's sort of an invitation. It's a gesture of kindness or friendliness. And not smiling is kind of strange, especially if you're looking at somebody. In some cultures, there's just smiling is not something that's super common. And, when I lived in LA for a long time, it's this crazy mix of people from all over the world, and you meet some really interesting and fascinating people. And I learned so much from people that were from different places and grew up in different cultures and households and stuff like that. And it was really cool because I was pretty ignorant, I think, when I first moved up there. So getting to know people from different places and getting to learn about their different experiences was just so eye-opening for me. One thing that I would notice sometimes is I would walk, for example, I'd be like walking to my car in a parking lot. And there'd be someone else standing over at their car, and they would stare at me. And if somebody's looking at me and I make eye contact with them, the first thing that I do is I smile or I nod, I acknowledge them. If that person does not do anything, they don't smile, they don't blink, they don't break eye contact, they just keep staring at me, well, then I'm like, well, this is weird. Why is this person still looking at me? And so probably to avoid confrontation, I'll just look away or look down. But then I kind of want to know, is this person still looking at me? So I'll look back and they're still staring at me. Just completely just looking. And so then I'm like, okay, well, in my experience, from my culture, the way that I have been conditioned, I suppose, is that now this is a threat. Why is this person looking at me? What do they want? And so there's so much, there's an opportunity for a major misunderstanding because some people they grow up and there's just absolutely nothing wrong with looking at somebody. They don't mean anything by it. It's not negative. It's not meant to be threatening. It's not meant to be disrespectful. They just, look at a person that's walking by. And they won't be fazed by eye contact. And it's no big deal. So there's a big opportunity for miscommunication, for misunderstanding, and perhaps even conflict over nothing. Nothing was said. There was nonverbal communication that was misunderstood. There was a message that was packaged up and sent, and then a message maybe that was sent back. And those messages got very confused. So how we communicate and the language that we use, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, even though you could have the biggest vocabulary ever and you could know all these great words to poetically describe what it is that you're trying to say, there is still some lack of control. And there is some inaccuracy because you can't control the meaning of your words for someone else. How someone else associates your words with their own experience is going to influence their understanding of your words on some level. And we just need to accept that. Recognize that and accept that. What I feel deep down in my heart about something that I care about can never perfectly be articulated with just the words that I have in my vocabulary. I know that. And I try to remind myself of that when I am trying to understand what other people are saying. That this person is trying to communicate something to me. And they are using the best, most accurate words and language at their disposal to try to communicate that to me. But I don't truly know what those words mean for them, and they don't truly know what those words mean for me. So I can do my best to try to understand them on their own terms and craft a response that takes that into account. But to some degree, I'm never going to fully know. I'm never going to fully be able to understand what it is that they are trying to get across. I can get close. And the more time I spend with people, the closer I get. But I just found that so interesting that language really influences the way that we think and the way that we act. But at the same time, the way that we think and the way that we feel in some ways gets limited or trapped or diminished by the words that we have available to us. Maybe in another 100 years when we're all telepathic, we'll be able to really understand what we're trying to say to each other. Who knows? So it's acceptance, though. Acceptance. Accept that you don't fully know the meaning of certain words for certain people and that they don't know that for you. And then move on. And just because we can accept that we don't understand all of the associations and all of the weight that certain words carry for certain people doesn't mean that we can't try to become better at communicating and using language better. The better we can use language, the closer we're going to get to this. And that's kind of the action item for the week is we're going to pick one type of word and we're going to go on a detox for that type of word. It's hedging language. So basically when I just used one, not a hedging word, but I used a filler word. Basically, essentially, like, I say all the time. Okay, here we go. So I also use so a lot. We use filler words, booster words, hedging language to soften our message, to make it more palatable, maybe to make it more accessible or more acceptable to certain people. And what that does is it waters down the strength of what it is you're trying to say. It waters down the accuracy of what it is that you're trying to say. So we're going to try to use more definitive language and avoid hedging. Filler words would be like, Booster words are words like it's overuse of words like incredibly, tremendously, definitely, always, never. So words that we use to try to boost up the meaning when we really don't have to. Booster punctuation's huge. I'm so guilty of that. I use exclamation points almost every sentence if I'm not careful. But I want people to know. I want people to know that I'm exclaiming at it, what it is that I'm trying to say. It's funny. Text messaging has ruined language and context in a lot of ways for us. That's a whole different episode. So, definitive language and hedging language. Hedging is like, I'll try, I might, I'm thinking about it, I think. It's vague. It's basically a way to avoid commitment. What time do you want to call? 4:30-ish? Let's touch base. Let's touch base tomorrow in the afternoon. That is avoidance. That is avoidance. If you want to talk tomorrow afternoon, I will call you at 3 p.m. Does that work for you? Boom, done, right? So this week, I want you to practice avoiding hedging language. In order to avoid it, you just have to become aware of it. So number one is pay attention. Pay attention to when you say, I'll try to get there by noon. I'll try to give you a call. I think I might be able to possibly do that. Notice when you are using those vague words, those words that they're non-committal. Notice those and see where you can start to pull some of that out. So I want you to carve out a specific block of time. You can't just go from using a bunch of hedging language to, okay, I'm just not going to do that anymore. It's hard. So I want you to carve out a specific block of time in which you will be communicating. It could be over if you're doing a lot of emailing or that kind of thing, or if you are speaking to people. The non-committal stuff happens probably a lot at a job, but it could also happen in your personal relationships. So pick a time when you'll be doing a little bit more communication. Pay attention and correct yourself anytime you use some kind of hedging language. So if you catch yourself saying, I'll try, I might, possibly, I think, catch it and be definitive about it. I will call you. I will be there at this time. I am going to do this. Or I won't. And not I can't, because you can. Most times you can. So really own it. I'm not going to do that. It's so freeing. It feels so good. I'm not going to do that. How bad could it be? I mean, don't get fired over this, but the hedging language is a very powerful thing. It's sneaky. It sneaks in there. We use it. We don't know that we're using it as much as we do. So try to pay attention to it, become aware of it, and start to pull some of that stuff out and have fun with it. Have fun with it because it's fun. It'll get a little silly. That's all I got for you this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love you, and I will talk to you soon.